Today I'm going to talk about smartphones. Cue intro music. To be more specific, I'm going to be talking about my smartphones, the smartphones that I've owned in my lifetime. First of all, we're going to have to scroll back a few years because to start off, I had flip phones and slide phones like anyone else from my generation. And I didn't get on the smartphone bandwagon for probably 2 or 3 years after the smartphones started taking off. My first smartphone experience was the Samsung Galaxy Apollo. With its 3.2-inch screen, a 240 by 400 resolution, it was actually worse than the second generation iPod that I was using, which boasted a 3.5-inch display with a 320 by 480 resolution. Still nothing phenomenal, but somehow better than the smartphone that I was so excited to use. The Apollo was slow, it was groggy, and the Samsung software wasn't user-friendly. It was running Android Eclair, or 2.1, and it had a 3.15 megapixel camera. Yeah, low enough that they actually had to mention that 0.15. It shot 320p video at 15 frames a second. And while I was using the iPod Touch, it felt like a phone like this had no point in my life. So I ended up actually putting the SIM card I had back into a slide phone and continuing to use that with my iPod Touch. So eventually I ended up using the Samsung Galaxy S Fascinate 4G. Yes, that's its official name. It was a slightly upgraded version of the regular Samsung Galaxy S, but it still towered over the Samsung Galaxy Apollo in every aspect. It had a 4-inch screen, a 480 by 800 resolution with a 5 megapixel camera. It actually shot 720p video in 30 frames. I mean, the front-facing camera left a lot to be desired with a 0.3 megapixel VGA shooter, but as selfie culture wasn't really a thing back then, it wasn't as big of a deal. The phone ran fairly well and could accomplish basic tasks, like running Facebook or even some simple games. The biggest downside was it was running Android 2.2 or Froyo, and it was impossible to upgrade, which led me to buy a Nexus 4 the Nexus day, or the next day. This was my first time using a phone that wasn't made by Samsung, and the freedom blew my mind. Rocking a 4.7-inch display with a 1280 by 768 resolution. It was bigger at the time than all the iPhones that I'd see and laugh at. It had a somewhat impressive 8 megapixel rear shooter and a sad 1.3 megapixel front-facing camera. It had 2 gigs of RAM and it ran flawlessly. I loved that phone, from its front and glass back to the soft touch plastic all around the sides. The look of it and the feel of it in the hands. And since it didn't have any of Samsung's bloatware, it ran most things without a hitch. Games hardly lagged, apps fully loaded, and it was running Android 4.2, so it could actually multitask, like the phones of the past. Sadly, one day I was spinning it in my hand nonchalantly while I was walking along and I dropped it face down, shattering the screen and the digitizer. Led me to go the next day and end up buying a Nexus 5, a 4.95-inch display at 1080p, and a quad-core processor with a more powerful 2 gigabytes of RAM. The camera was also an 8 megapixel shooter with a 1.3 megapixel front-facing camera, just like its predecessor. It just had some better quality under better lighting. This phone didn't blow me away, it didn't speak to me on a newer sort of mythological level. It just got the job done. It had the same soft touch material as the sides of the Nexus 4, but it was wrapped around the entirety of the phone, of course aside from the glass on the front. It ran all the apps of its time, perfectly fine, running Android 4.4 KitKat, but lagged behind in certain areas of the other phones of its time, like in the camera or the battery. In December of 2014, I went and bought the Xperia Z3. This phone blew my mind from the moment I bought it. I went to Dairy Queen shortly after and took this picture of French fries, which still amazes me to this day. Rocking a 5.2-inch 1080p display, it had a crazy 20.3 megapixel camera. It shot 2K video, and with a 2.2 megapixel front-facing camera that would also shoot 1080p. Although the base camera software had a beauty mode for the front-facing camera that made it look like I was poorly editing every single photo that I took. This phone's camera game was incredibly crispy, and some of the photos that I took on it can still be compared to the phones of today. It had another quad-core processor and ran most things without an issue. And before 2016, yeah, it was a thing, waterproof. The only difference is it had covers for all the ports to make sure that water got in nowhere. But what the phone did have was a weak screen. Anything more than a gentle tap on the screen would cause discoloration. The glass wasn't Gorilla Glass. It was very easily scratched. I even had a tempered glass screen protector, which is supposed to take the blow of the hit, but the phone fell 2 inches out of my pocket on my step one night and shattered completely. This time back to my old friend, Samsung. 2 weeks after its initial release, I bought the Samsung Galaxy Note 5. This phone was phenomenal. Hell, if I needed to, I would still use it to this day. It rocked a 5.7-inch 2560 by 1440 display, running Lollipop with, well, Samsung's TouchWiz bloatware, but with its octa-core processor and 3 gigs of RAM, it still ran flawlessly. A 16-megapixel shooter that shot in 4K, a 5-megapixel front-facing selfie cam that took incredibly decent photos, although it kind of stretched them because it was meant for a wider audience. It came with an incredibly adjustable and user-friendly camera app. This phone redefined what a smartphone could be to me. The stylus was creative and useful. The phone just worked. And it worked well. Sure, it didn't have the waterproof design like the Xperia, but for the most part, that just seemed like a gimmick to me anyway. The phone's design was excellent. It felt great in the hand. That all-glass design with the aluminum frame and the sapphire black finish was just phenomenal. But as all good things do, it had to come to an end. Friend and I ended up trading phones. Ended up using the Huawei Nexus 6P. It was an excellent phone, running the same size 5.7-inch display with another 2560 by 1440. It came factory with Android Marshmallow and had a slightly smaller octa-core processor, though decidedly faster because it was pure stock. Though I love the phone and do label it as one of the best phones of 2015, it was lackluster when you compared it to the Note 5. The 12.3 megapixel camera was an absolute joke when you stood it next to the Note 5. And even though it had an 8-megapixel selfie cam, it was terrible unless you were in fantastic lighting. The metal squared off body just didn't feel as nice in the hand, and it didn't have a stylus, which wasn't a huge deal, but it left me going for that click-clack pen all the time. The 6P was and is an incredible phone and the last of the Nexus lineup, but to me it just became another phone. Fast forward another 6 months to the release of the Samsung Galaxy Note 7. I was excited, to say the least. Even though the specs were similar to that of its little brother, I still needed the phone. On release day, I received the device, and for 3 weeks I cradled it and kept it close to me. Back to the 5.7-inch 1440p Super AMOLED display and an incredible 12-megapixel camera with an incredibly decent 5-megapixel front-facing camera, 64 gigs of base internal storage, and the option to upgrade if need be. The phone looked, felt, and just was as professional as any phone possibly could have been, and still to this day is my favorite phone design of all time. Sadly, we all know how that tale ends. I was asked to return it, and I had the option of getting a new one, or an S7 Edge, or even just to be fully refunded. So I put my SIM card back in the Nexus 6P and decided I was just gonna stick with it until something else stood out. Anyone that knows me can vouch for the fact that I've never been a big fan of Apple. I've used the iPod Touch, the iPod Nano, any of the iPods because for music they're fantastic. I just thought all their products were overpriced for the sake of getting money. But with my Note 7 dead and my contract freed up, I decided, well, let's just go for it. Let's try out the competition. So I pre-ordered a 128 gig iPhone 7 Plus in matte black. I have never used a phone that lagged so little. People can talk smack about Apple all they want, but Apple has cornered their market. The iPhone 7 is sporting a slightly smaller 5.5-inch 1080p display, and it's only an LCD. It's got 3 gigs of RAM, as opposed to the 4 gigs in every other phone. It's also only got a 2900 milliamp hour battery. Apple utilizes the batteries better than everyone. I can get a full day of use, if not more, from my iPhone. And realistically, someone around you always has an iPhone charger. The 12-megapixel camera can shoot incredibly crispy 4K video, and a beautiful 1080 at 60 frames. Even the front-facing camera is great for vlogs or selfies. And I'm back to the classic waterproof design, minus the weird flaps on the Xperia. People complain about the lack of headphone jack, but it's not a necessity. Sure, Apple doesn't allow as much customization, but its intuitive, easy-to-use design trumps everything else on the market. But just the easy-to-use nature and the way it interacts with all other Apple products make it incredible to me. It makes it a no-brainer. I mean, after I bought the iPhone, 3 days later I bought a MacBook Pro, a month before the announcement of the new MacBook Pro, but nonetheless. I even bought a used iMac. Apple works flawlessly with Apple. You don't get that with Android, even with a bunch of third-party apps. Who doesn't want to take a picture and have it right on their computer when they get home? I mean, sure, all this could change. My opinion could change drastically this year. 2017 is bound to be a huge year for phones. We're gonna have a new Note. We're gonna have a new iPhone. We're gonna have a new Pixel. We're gonna have new LG phones. We're gonna have new Huawei phones. We're gonna have new phones from everyone. And I'm excited to see what comes of it. But right now, as it stands, the iPhone 7 Plus is the best phone I've ever used. So that's the story about all my smartphones. And maybe I haven't had as many smartphones as a lot of people, but I hope to get more. Maybe I won't be filming with my phone so I can actually review them at some point. Either way, thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.